moment I walked through that door, I knew exactly what they thought of me. 347 alien representatives packed into the grand conclave of Velkarath, and every single one of them looked at me the way a wealthy man looks at a stranger who wandered into his house and sat down at his dinner table. Not with anger, not with alarm, just with that particular kind of quiet amusement that said, without a single word being spoken, that I did not belong here. I was not offended. I had walked into rooms like this before, rooms full of people who had already decided what I was before I opened my mouth. I had learned, a long time ago, that the most useful thing a person can do in a room like that is say nothing, watch everything, and let the other side believe what they want for as long as it serves you. My name is Darren Voss. I am 51 years old. I have gray in my hair and a scar along my left jaw that I got on a world whose name most people in this room had never heard. I was wearing my dress uniform, the gray one that Earth issues for formal occasions, with a single iron stripe on the collar. No decorations, no medals, no ceremonial weapon or diplomatic sash. I carried a metal flask on my hip that I had owned for 20 years, and I carried it because I liked it, and because it annoyed people who expected symbols of power, and sometimes annoying people is itself a kind of power. The hall was unlike anything I had ever seen on Earth. I say that not to be dramatic, but because it is simply true. The Velkarath had been building this conclave hall for 600 years, and it showed. The walls were made of living crystal, a material grown rather than cut, shaped by a process that took generations to complete. The crystal caught the light of the three suns visible through the ceiling panels and threw it across the floor in long, shifting rivers of color. Red and gold and deep blue moved slowly across the stone, and when the angle of the light shifted, the colors shifted with it, so that the whole hall felt like the inside of a slow sunrise. The ceiling was high enough that a moderate-sized building could have fit beneath it. The seats were arranged in concentric rings around a central floor, where speakers stood when they had something to say. Each ring had its own designation. The inner rings were for the civilizations that mattered, the ones with fleets and resources and the kind of long history that makes other people step aside when you walk into a room. The outer rings were for everyone else. I had been assigned to the outer ring. I found my seat without being guided. I had studied the seating chart before arriving, something I always do, and I knew exactly where I was supposed to sit and exactly what it meant that I had been put there. The outer ring was not an accident. It was a message. Terra was new. Terra was small. Terra was allowed to observe, allowed to be present, but not allowed to be important. I sat down, settled into the chair, and looked around. To my left was the Dreth ambassador, a compact, insect-like creature with 6 limbs and a face that was mostly a cluster of sensory organs arranged around a small, precise mouth. He shifted in his seat the moment I sat down, moved his chair a few centimeters away from mine, and then went back to studying his notes as though nothing had happened. I did not take it personally. Dreth have a biological imperative around what they call contamination zones, a survival instinct evolved on a world where many things were quietly lethal. He was not being rude. He was just being Dreth. To my right was an empty seat. The representative from the Omera Collective had apparently not arrived yet. Directly across the hall, in the inner ring, the Sarath Dominion delegation occupied a full section of 6 seats, all of them draped in the deep black ceremonial armor that the Sarath wore to formal occasions. Their armor was not exactly armor in the conventional sense. It was made of a material called glass iron, which the Sarath had developed 400 years ago, and which they still refused to share with any other civilization. It was harder than most metals, could bend slightly under impact rather than shattering, and was also, somehow, beautiful. Deep black with a faint internal shimmer, like starlight seen through dark water. At the center of the Sarath delegation sat Princess Selvara. I had read her file before coming to Velkarath. I read everyone's file before going anywhere. Selvara was the third heir to what the Sarath called the Obsidian Throne, the ruling seat of the Sarath Dominion, which controlled 11 star systems, maintained a fleet of 412 active warships, and had not lost a military engagement in 90 years. She was 34 years old by Sarath reckoning, which translated to approximately 41 Earth years. She had commanded a warship by the time she was 20. She had led a fleet action by the time she was 27. She was, by any honest measurement, one of the most accomplished military minds in the Oran cluster. She was also, at this moment, looking at me the way I might look at a lost child who had wandered into a place it did not understand. She did not look away when I caught her eye. That was interesting. Most people, when caught staring, look away. Selvara held the look, then tilted her head slightly, a gesture that I would later learn was a Sarath expression of theatrical pity, and turned back to her aide to say something I could not hear. Whatever she said, her aide's expression shifted into something close to amusement. I opened my flask, took a slow drink, and went back to studying the room. The Grand Arbiter of the Velkarath called the conclave to order at precisely the appointed hour. He was old, very old, with the gray-scaled skin of a Velkarath elder and the careful, measured movements of a creature that had lived long enough to know that speed is rarely as useful as precision. His name was Veldar Othan, and he had been running these meetings for 312 years, which meant he had been doing this job before most of the civilizations in this room had achieved spaceflight. He opened the session with a formal greeting delivered in Galactic Standard, the trade language used by most of the cluster's civilizations, developed over centuries of contact and now spoken, in varying degrees of proficiency, by nearly everyone present. He welcomed each delegation in turn, accompanied by a bioluminescent display from the walls of the hall, the Velkarath's traditional way of honoring guests. Each civilization got a display that corresponded to the color and intensity of their standing within the cluster. The Muralax Dominion got a deep, sustained red, a powerful and ancient color in Velkarath ceremony. The Dreth Collective got a layered green that moved like something alive. The Sarath Dominion got a cold, precise white that hit the walls and held steady, the kind of light that made everything it touched look both cleaner and more dangerous. When the Arbiter reached Terra, the wall behind me produced a dull, gray-blue flicker that lasted approximately 2 seconds and then faded. Laughter moved through the room. Not everyone laughed, but enough did. The kind of laughter that does not bother to be quiet, because it does not expect anyone to object to it. I did not react. I took another slow drink from my flask and waited. The Arbiter worked through the formal ceremony with practiced efficiency, pausing at each delegation for the correct amount of time, never rushing, but never lingering either. When he finally reached the section of the proceedings where each civilization was asked to make a formal statement of contribution, a tradition in these conclaves, where each member declared their role in the prosperity and safety of the cluster, he began from the innermost ring and worked outward. The Velkarath spoke of the Great Relay Network, the system of faster-than-light communication relays they had built over 2 centuries, which allowed information to travel between distant star systems in hours rather than years. Without that network, the cluster's civilizations would have spent the last 200 years being almost entirely ignorant of each other. The Muralax spoke of the Rim Wars. 40 years ago, something had come from beyond the known edge of the cluster and attempted to push inward. The Muralax, enormous, physically powerful, and in possession of a military tradition that stretched back 1,000 years, had held the line. They had lost ships, people, whole colonies. They had held anyway. When it was over, the threat was gone, and the Muralax stood at the rim like a wall that had decided not to fall. The Dreth spoke of biological synthesis and planetary cultivation, the science of making dead worlds livable, of seeding life into barren soil, and engineering the chemistry of atmospheres until they could support the kind of complex biological systems that allow civilizations to thrive. 14 of the cluster's currently inhabited worlds were livable today because of Dreth science. The Sarath spoke last among the major powers. Selvara did not stand. Her senior aide, a tall male Sarath in lighter armor, rose and delivered the formal statement in the measured, slightly theatrical style that the Sarath favored for public occasions. He spoke of the Veil fleets, the Sarath's naval forces, which had served as the cluster's primary enforcement mechanism for cluster law for the past 90 years. When trading agreements were violated, when piracy threatened shipping lanes, when smaller civilizations were being pressured by their neighbors, the Veil fleets appeared, and the problem became significantly easier to resolve. It was, I will admit, an impressive record. Then the Arbiter reached me. "Terra," he said, in the careful, neutral tone of someone who is being polite about something they consider a formality. "Sergeant Major Darren Voss, you are recognized. Please state your civilization's contribution." I put the flask away. I stood up slowly, Not dramatically, just at the pace that felt natural. I looked around the room for a moment without speaking. Not because I was nervous or uncertain. I have never been nervous in a room full of strangers. I was looking at them because I wanted to see their faces clearly, and because I wanted them to understand, in the few seconds before I spoke, that I was not the lost child Selvara's expression had suggested. Then I said 7 words. "We are still here. That is enough." The silence that followed lasted about 2 seconds. Then the laughter came back. Broader this time, less careful about concealing itself. The Dreth ambassador clicked his mandibles in what I had been told was a sound Dreth make, when they find something simultaneously amusing and beneath their attention. Several of the Vel'Karath at the inner ring exchanged looks. The Muralax ambassador simply stared at me, with the expression of a very large creature that is not sure whether the small thing in front of it is being deliberately provocative or simply does not understand the situation. Princess Selvara did not laugh. She watched me with those 4 eyes, 2 forward-facing, 2 set at the temples, and her expression had shifted. The theatrical pity was still there, but underneath it, something else had appeared. Something I could not name yet. Not quite curiosity. More like the moment when a person sees something that does not quite fit the category they have already prepared for it. She leaned slightly forward and said, in Galactic Standard, in a voice that was clear enough for the people immediately around her to hear, and quiet enough to seem casual. The infant speaks with the confidence of someone who has actually done something. Tell me, Terran, have you done something? Anything that might justify that extraordinary confidence? A moon, perhaps? A very challenging asteroid? Your own survival, maybe, though I understand even that remains somewhat uncertain for your species. The people around her heard it. Some smiled. The Arbiter's expression did not change, which was its own kind of commentary. The Vel'Karath have very precise control of their faces, and the fact that he chose not to intervene said exactly as much as a response would have. I looked at her for 3 full seconds. Long enough for it to be intentional. Long enough for her to know that I was not flustered, not embarrassed, not searching for a response. Then I said, "Give it time, Your Highness." I sat down, picked up my flask, and went back to watching the room. The session continued. Trade agreements, resource sharing, navigation rights through contested systems, the kind of detailed, careful negotiation that is the actual business of these conclaves. Once the ceremony is finished, I listened to all of it. I did not speak again. I took notes in the small device I had brought with me, not because I needed written notes, but because writing things down gives you a reason to look at your hands, and looking at your hands occasionally gives other people in a room the impression that you are occupied and not paying attention to them. People are less careful when they think they are not being watched. I was paying attention to everything. I was paying attention to the Vel'Karath Arbiter, who made decisions with a very particular kind of efficiency. The kind that comes from someone who already knows the outcome he wants, and is simply managing the process of arriving there. He was not a man who was genuinely searching for compromise. He was a man who knew what the compromise would be before the session started, and was guiding everyone toward it. I was paying attention to the Muralax ambassador, who spent significant parts of the session glancing at a device in his lap, which, based on the angle of his eyes, was showing him something that was not related to the session. His fleet, probably. The Muralax do not like being far from their ships. I was paying attention to Selvara, who, despite having delivered her comment about me with the confidence of someone who had already stopped thinking about the subject, had not actually stopped thinking about it. I could tell because she looked at me 4 separate times during the afternoon session. Not long looks, just the kind of brief, checking look that people make when something is sitting in the back of their mind and they cannot quite let it go. Good. At the end of the day's session, the delegations were released to their assigned quarters in the Vel'Karath diplomatic complex, a series of carefully designed spaces that attempted to accommodate the environmental needs of several dozen different species simultaneously. My quarters were small, functional, and at the far end of the corridor from the Serath delegations section. Also not an accident. I had been in my quarters for approximately 20 minutes when someone knocked at the door. It was not Selvara. It was an elderly Vel'Karath male with gray-green scales and the particular kind of stillness that very old beings develop when they have learned that most things are not worth moving quickly for. He was dressed simply, no ceremonial colors, no rank indicators. but something about the way he held himself suggested that the simplicity was a choice, not a limitation. "Sergeant Major Voss," he said. "My name is Kethal. I am an archivist." "What kind of archivist?" I asked. "The kind," he said, "who catalogs things that governments would prefer everyone forget." I stepped back from the door. "You had better come in." He sat across from me in the small common area of the quarters, and he did not waste time. He looked at me with the direct, unhurried gaze of someone who has spent 3 decades asking uncomfortable questions, and has long since stopped being embarrassed about it. "I have a question for you," he said. "Ask it." 14 years ago, he said, an event occurred in a system called Reach 9, in the Outer Territories, the Krath Swarm. You are familiar with them. I was. Most people who had been paying attention to the cluster's outer edges for the past 2 decades were familiar with the Krath Swarm. They were not exactly a civilization. They were something older, and considerably less interested in negotiation, a collective biological intelligence, spread across thousands of individual organisms, all coordinated by a central distributed mind that the cluster's scientists had spent 30 years trying to understand, and failing. They had consumed 17 planets in 11 days. The modeling systems of 7 major cluster civilizations had projected that, at their expansion rate, the Krath Overmind would reach the Muralax homeworld within 6 months. The swarm had stopped at Reach 9. Not slowed, not turned, stopped. Every Krath vessel within 4 light-years of Reach 9 had gone dormant overnight. 3 billion individual organisms, suddenly inert. The Overmind, destroyed. No one had been able to explain the mechanism. 7 governments had classified the incident, rather than admit publicly that they had no explanation for it. "There was a Terran vessel in that system," Kethal said. "One vessel. Not in any registry. It left before anyone could reach it." He paused. "You were on that vessel." It was not a question. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "The Krath were going to reach the Muralax homeworld." "Yes. That would have been bad. 3 billion people live on the Muralax homeworld," Kethal said. "Yes," I said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is not waiting for you to fill it, but thinking about what you have already said. "The princess does not know," he said finally, "what Terra actually is, what you have done, and where, and how many times. None of them in that hall know. I know they don't. Do you intend to tell them?" I looked out the small viewport in the wall of my quarters. The 3 suns of Velkarath were setting, one after another, and the sky was doing something extraordinary, layering 3 different colors of dusk on top of each other, so that the horizon looked like it could not make up its mind between red and gold and a deep, unusual purple. "Not until it matters," I said. "When will it matter?" I had been watching a light on the horizon for the past 90 seconds. Not a star. Stars do not move at that speed, or at that angle. This was a ship, dropping from faster-than-light travel into the system. It was large. It carried no identification beacon. "Probably," I said, "right now." Kethal turned and looked out the viewport. When he saw the light, his face did something I had never seen a Velkarath face do before. It went still, completely still. The stillness of someone who has spent their entire life studying history and has just watched something walk out of the records and into the present moment. "That signature," he said, very quietly. "That energy signature. I have only ever seen that signature in archived records from 400 years ago." "Yes," I said. "That is Urveth," he said. "Yes," I said again. He turned to look at me. His eyes, which were large and pale, and usually calm, were not calm right now. "They have not been seen in 400 years, he said. "Most of the cluster considers them mythological." "Most of the cluster," I said, "is wrong." I was already moving, already reaching for my communicator, already running, in the back of my mind, the calculations I had not wanted to need, and was not surprised to find myself needing anyway. Because that is the thing about preparation. You do not do it because you expect everything to go wrong. You do it because you know that when things go wrong, there is no time left to start. I had been preparing for this for a long time. The emergency session was called within the hour. Kethal had gone to the Grand Arbiter directly. bypassing 3 levels of diplomatic protocol because there was no time for diplomatic protocol. By the time the major delegations had been pulled from their quarters and assembled in the crisis chamber, a smaller, more secure room beneath the main hall, built into the bedrock of the complex, every scanner on Velkarath Prime had confirmed what the old archivist had already known the moment he saw that light on the horizon. The ship was Urveth. The crisis chamber was nothing like the grand hall above it. No living crystal, no rivers of colored light, just a circular room with stone walls and a central display table that projected real-time scanner data into the air above it, hard and blue and precise. 12 chairs around the table, pulled from their usual arrangement into something tighter. The major representatives only, inner ring civilizations plus any outer ring delegate who had been specifically summoned. I had not been summoned. I walked in anyway and sat down. No one asked me to leave. They were too frightened to manage the social geometry of the moment. The scanner data above the table showed a single vessel holding position approximately 400,000 kilometers above the planet's northern pole. It was not the largest ship I had ever seen, but it was large enough to command respect from any rational person. It was shaped, roughly, like something that had grown rather than been built. Organic curves and irregular protrusions, dark surfaces that absorbed scanner pings rather than reflecting them cleanly, making it difficult to get precise readings on its internal configuration. Every scanner the Velkarath had managed to aim at it was producing partial, uncertain data. The Muralax ambassador, whose name was Drath Ven Cole, and who was the largest individual in the room by a considerable margin, was already on a secured communication channel to his fleet. I could not hear what he was saying, but I could see from his posture that he was not making reassuring requests. He was issuing orders. Princess Selvara had arrived in the crisis chamber in full armor. Not the ceremonial glass iron she had worn in the main hall. This was the operational version. The same material, but configured for function rather than appearance. She had her aide beside her, and a tactical display running from a device strapped to her left forearm. She was already managing her fleet remotely. She was good under pressure. I noted that. The Grand Arbiter stood at the head of the table and delivered what he knew, in the flat, controlled tone of a person who has lived long enough to have experienced things going very wrong before, and who has learned that the most important thing in a crisis is to prevent panic from outrunning information. What he knew was this: the Urveth were, in the oldest records of the Velkarath and the Serath, and the 4 civilizations that preceded them in this region of the galaxy, something very close to a nightmare that had been given physical form. They were not a civilization in any sense that the current cluster's inhabitants would recognize. They did not build cities or develop culture or pursue knowledge for its own sake. They were old, far older than any current cluster species, and they had, 400 years ago, passed through this region of the galaxy and left behind them a trail of empty worlds. Not conquered worlds, not subjugated populations, empty ones. Worlds that had housed complex, spacefaring civilizations and which, after the Urveth passed through, had nothing on them at all. No ruins, no biological trace, no signal, just rock and atmosphere, as if the civilizations had never been there. 3 of those civilizations had been, by the standards of the time, comparable in size and capability to the current Serath Dominion. They were gone. The Urveth had apparently moved on to other regions of the galaxy, and over 4 centuries, the cluster had gradually reclassified them as either extinct or mythological, depending on which historian you preferred. They were neither. The Arbiter finished his briefing. The room was silent for a moment with the specific quality of silence that follows information that is too large to respond to immediately. Then Drath Ven Cole ended his communication channel, set down his device and said, in the low, resonant voice that the Muralax seemed to produce without effort, "The Iron Fleet can have 7 ships here within 6 hours, another 20 within 12. Full mobilization takes 3 days." "The Veil Fleet's nearest active squadron is 2 hours out," Selvara said, not looking up from her forearm display. "I am recalling them now. Full Dominion response will take longer." Everyone looked at the Arbiter. The Arbiter looked at the scanner data. The scanner data did not help. I cleared my throat. Just once, quietly. Everyone looked at me. I said, "Before we discuss fleet movements, I would like to know if anyone in this room has heard of a civilization called the Helion Compact." The room did not know what to do with that. Selvara raised her forward eyes from the display on her forearm and looked at me directly. "That is not relevant to the current situation," said one of the Velkarath advisors. A younger one, not the arbiter, the kind who confuses urgency with certainty. "It might be," said Kethal, who had come in behind me and taken a seat at the outer edge of the table. He said it quietly, almost to himself, but it landed in the room like a small stone dropped into still water. Selvara's eyes moved to the old archivist, then back to me. Whatever she saw in my expression, she did not dismiss it the way the young advisor had. "I am not familiar with the Helion Compact," she said carefully. "What is it?" "Was," I said. 60 years ago. Aggressive expansionist civilization. Attempted to claim 6 Earth colony worlds by force. 14 warships per system. More than 400 total. Significantly more military capability than Terra at the time. I paused. Within 9 months, the Helion Compact had no military capability remaining. Their civilian population was untouched. Their government sent peace envoys to Earth. They are currently one of our closest trading partners. The room was quiet again. 9 months, said Drath Ven Cole. 9 months, I confirmed. For a civilization with 400 warships. At the time, I said, we had 31. I let that sit for a moment, long enough for the arithmetic to work. "That is not possible," said the young Velkarath advisor. Kethal looked at the advisor with the patient expression of a person who has spent his career finding things that were not supposed to be possible, and writing them down carefully. He said nothing. He did not need to. "The records," Selvara said slowly, "would support what he is saying. The Helion Compact exists. I have read references to them. A mid-tier expansionist civilization from the outer edge of the cluster's mapped territory, 60 years ago." She paused. "The records note that they became significantly less expansionist, following contact with a newly emerged species from a system at the edge of cluster space." Another pause. "The records do not explain why." "No," I agreed. "They don't." "Why not?" "Because the Helion government agreed to classify the details as a condition of the peace arrangement." "And your government agreed to that?" "It seemed fair," I said. "They had stopped trying to take our worlds. We had stopped doing what we were doing. Everyone had an interest in the situation being quiet."
"What were you doing?"
she asked. The question was direct. No performance in it. Just genuine wanting to know. I looked at her for a moment. "Whatever it took," I said. Another silence. This one had a different texture to it. Not the silence of people who were frightened. The silence of people who were reconsidering. The communication panel on the table chimed. The arbiter answered it and listened. His expression, which had already been controlled in the way of old survivors, controlled itself further, tightened at the edges, in the way of someone receiving news that they had hoped would not arrive. "The Urveth ship has transmitted a message," he said, "on all frequencies. The translation systems are working." It took the systems 40 minutes. 40 minutes, during which the representatives sat in the crisis chamber and waited, and very carefully, did not look at each other more than necessary. During those 40 minutes, I used my personal communicator to send 3 messages on a frequency that was not available in the cluster's standard communication range. I sent them without explaining to anyone in the room what I was doing, and no one asked. They had other things on their minds. The translation came back in pieces. The Urveth language did not map cleanly onto Galactic Standard, and the systems were working with partial pattern matches, rather than a complete reference library. What they produced was imperfect, but it was clear enough. The Urveth had returned to what they called the grazing territories, the Oran cluster. The civilizations within it were, in their understanding of the universe, not civilizations in any meaningful sense. They were a resource. Something that reproduced and organized itself during the time between Urveth visits, like growth that occurs in a field between harvests. The message offered a choice. Submit a quota, a number of living individuals from each member civilization, to be provided within 72 hours, or face what the translation systems rendered as complete processing. The translation notes attached to that phrase indicated that the Urveth term had no precise equivalent in Galactic Standard, but was semantically closest to a word used by agricultural societies for what happens to a field at the end of a season. The room received this information in the kind of silence that has weight to it. Then, with a speed that I found both understandable and deeply unpleasant, the conclave's senior representatives began doing the mathematics. The Velkarath Grand Arbiter used careful language. He spoke of strategic considerations and civilizational triage, and the necessity of prioritizing the continuation of the most complex and developed social structures. He spoke of the outer ring civilizations, the smaller, newer, less developed members of the conclave, as, essentially, a buffer, a way to satisfy the immediate demand, while the major civilizations arranged their military response. He did not say it directly. He used the kind of diplomatic language that allows people to discuss terrible things without having to use words that make the terrible thing visible. But I have been listening to people not say things for 20 years, and I understood exactly what he was not saying. I sat there for 40 minutes and listened to it develop, watched it take shape, watched the Muralax ambassador's expression suggest that this was a practical solution to an impossible problem, watched the representative of the Dreth Collective, the people who had moved their chair away from mine on the first day, look at the floor with the expression of someone who had understood, and hated what they understood, and was going to say nothing anyway. Selvara said nothing. She watched the room with her arms crossed and her 4 eyes moving between the speakers with an expression I could not quite read. I waited until the proposal had been stated clearly enough that there was no ambiguity about what was being suggested. Then I stood up. "No," I said. The arbiter looked at me with the patient tolerance of someone who does not want to lose his temper in a crisis. "Sergeant Major Voss, Terra's position is noted." "I am not stating a position," I said. "I am telling you what is going to happen. No one in this hall, and no one in this cluster, is being handed to anything. Not in 72 hours. Not ever. Not while I am in the room." "You are one person," said the Muralax ambassador, "representing a civilization with 12 warships, which is less than the number of ships I have in this system right now, telling this conclave what will and will not happen. Do you understand how that sounds?" 14, I said. He stared at me. "We built 2 more last week," I said. I reached for my communicator and opened a channel on the non-standard frequency I had used earlier. I opened it on speaker. I had thought about whether to do this, whether to keep it private, and decided that the room needed to hear it. The channel connected. A voice came through, calm, even slightly relaxed, which was a tone I had always found useful when everyone else in a situation was moving toward panic. The voice said, "You have been quiet for a long time. I was beginning to think the conclave was going better than expected." "It was going exactly as expected," I said. "Status?" "The Urveth vessel has been scanning the planet's surface since it arrived. Long-range sensors suggest they are looking for biological density readings, population centers essentially. I have been passively monitoring their communication traffic. They are waiting for a response to their message. What happens if they don't get one they like? Based on their communication patterns and the energy readings from their drives, they are prepared to escalate. I cannot predict the timeline precisely, but I would estimate that the 72-hour window in their message is not the real limit of their patience." The room was completely silent. Every representative at that table was listening. "Who is that?" asked Selvara, quietly, without the performance. "My ship," I said. "Your ship is talking to you." "My ship has been parked behind the 4th moon since before the conclave started," I said. "She arrived 2 days ago. She detected the Urveth energy signature the moment they entered the system, which was approximately 6 hours before they appeared on anyone else's sensors." I looked around the room, at the Arbiter, at Drath Ven Cole, at the Dreth representative who was staring at the communicator with an expression of utter displacement, at Selvara, whose expression had gone through 3 different things in the last 20 seconds and was currently somewhere that I could not categorize. "The Urveth gave us 72 hours, I said. "I am going to use them. I need the conclave to keep the diplomatic channel open and keep the situation calm. I need the major fleets positioned, but not advancing. And I need everyone in this room to trust that when I say no one is being handed to anything, I mean it." "Why should we trust that?" asked the young Velkarath advisor. His voice was not hostile. It was genuinely asking. I looked at him. He was young. He had probably grown up in a galaxy that made sense to him, organized into tiers and rings and historical precedents, with the Velkarath at the center of things because they had always been at the center of things.
Because, I said, In 62 years of spacefaring, Earth has never lost a world.
The room did not know what to do with that either, because it was true, and because if you thought about it long enough, you realized that it was an extraordinary thing to be true. 62 years, 4 hostile contacts, every colony still standing. I picked up my flask and walked out of the crisis chamber. Behind me, I heard Kethal say, very quietly, to no one in particular, "There are things about that civilization that are not in any file that anyone in this room has access to." And then I heard Selvara say, equally quietly, "I am beginning to understand that." I walked to the end of the corridor and opened a full channel to my ship. "Ilara," I said. That was her name. Not her designation. Her actual name. The one she had chosen 15 years ago, when we first started working together. "Tell me everything you know about the Urveth fleet that is still sitting at the edge of the system." 47 ships, she said immediately, holding position at the system boundary. The single scout vessel above the planet is transmitting back to the fleet at regular intervals. If it stops transmitting, they will know something has happened. If it transmits a specific distress signal, they will advance immediately. A pause. There is also a third option. If the scout transmits a success signal, meaning the civilizations here have agreed to comply, the fleet will advance anyway to begin collection. The offer is not an offer. It is a preparation. I had suspected that. It is what I would have done if I were the kind of thing that thought of populated worlds as fields to be harvested. "Can you communicate with the scout?" I asked. "Yes." "Can you communicate with the main fleet?" "Yes, but the signal delay at that distance means responses will take time." "What is our current weapons status?" "Full complement. The refit at Tycho Station 6 months ago included the updated targeting systems. We are carrying 4 long-range suppression arrays, 2 standard engagement configurations, and the device from the Reach 9 mission." I stopped walking. "The Reach 9 device," I said. "Is it operational?" "It has always been operational," she said. "I have simply been waiting for you to ask." I stood in the corridor for a moment. The stone walls of the Velkarath complex were very still around me. Somewhere above, the 3 suns of this world were continuing their slow, separate journeys toward the horizon, indifferent to what was happening on the planet beneath them. "Run me the calculations," I said. "Original design versus 47 targets. Give me the numbers." "That will take approximately 3 hours. Start now." "Already running," she said. "I started when the Urveth fleet arrived." I almost smiled. "Good," I said. "Keep the diplomatic channel monitored. If their behavior changes, any change at all, tell me immediately." "Understood." "And Darren?"
Yes.
"There is someone following you down the corridor." I turned around. Selvara was standing 10 meters behind me. She had followed me out of the crisis chamber. She was not wearing her performance expression. She was not wearing any particular expression at all, just looking at me with all 4 eyes with the directness of someone who has decided that this particular moment requires honesty. "I want to know," she said, "what Earth actually is, what you actually are. Not the diplomatic version, not the 12 warships and a flask version." She paused. "The real one." I looked at her for a moment. "Give me 72 hours, I said, "and you will see it." "And if 72 hours is not enough?" "It will be," I said. "One way or another, it always is." The first 12 hours of the 72 taught me more about the civilizations in that conclave than 6 months of reading their files had. How a person behaves when they are frightened is the truest thing about them. Not how they behave when things are going well, not how they present themselves in ceremony or negotiation, but what they reach for when the ground starts moving. Some people reach for control. Some reach for numbers, the comfort of calculation, the idea that if you can measure a danger precisely enough, you can manage it. Some people reach for other people, instinctively, the way living things move toward warmth. And some people, when they are frightened, start looking for someone else to put between themselves and the thing that is frightening them. The Velkarath Grand Arbiter spent those first 12 hours in the formal diplomatic channel, sending measured, carefully worded communications to the Urveth scout vessel. He was not negotiating. He was stalling, buying time the way experienced administrators buy time, with language that sounds like progress and commits to nothing. It was not an ignoble strategy. Buying time is a legitimate tool when you have someone working the problem on the other side of the clock. The problem was, he did not know he had someone working it. He was stalling because he could not think of anything else to do. The Muralax ambassador spent the same 12 hours coordinating fleet movements. By hour 8, he had 11 ships in the system. By hour 12, he had 19. They were positioned in a defensive arc above the planet. Visually impressive, militarily sound, and completely inadequate for the actual problem, which was not one scout vessel above the pole but 47 Urveth ships at the system boundary that were watching everything on sensors far better than anything the Conclave's combined fleet had access to. I did not say this out loud. The fleet was necessary, not because it would win a direct engagement, but because its presence told the Urveth that the cluster's civilizations intended to resist, and resistance, in my experience, changes the mathematics of what the other side is willing to attempt. Things that feed on populations that simply accept being fed upon have a different calculation than things that feed on populations prepared to make the meal expensive. Selvara's Veil fleet arrived in system at hour 4, 8 ships, tight formation, executing the kind of precise synchronized positioning that takes years of drilling to achieve. She directed them personally from the crisis chamber, barely sleeping, her forearm display running constant updates. I watched her work and recognized in her the specific discipline of someone who had been trained for this. Not just trained in tactics and ship handling, but trained in the way that combat leadership actually functions, which is less about knowing exactly what to do, and more about keeping your thinking clear when every instinct is screaming at you to panic. She was very good. I filed that away. At hour 13, she found me in the corridor outside the communications room where I had been for most of the night, running numbers with Alara and building the framework of what I was beginning to call, internally, the only actual solution. "You have not slept," she said. "Neither have you. I am Sereth. We require less sleep than most cluster species. I am human. We run on stubbornness and bad habits." She almost smiled. It was a small thing, and she controlled it quickly, but it was there. She sat down against the wall of the corridor, armor and all, with the unself-conscious practicality of a soldier who has learned to rest wherever there is a wall to lean on. "Tell me about the Krav oligarchy," she said. I looked at her. "Kethal has been talking to you. Kethal has given me access to his archive," she said. "Not everything. He says some of it is not ready to be shared, but enough." She looked at me steadily. "The Krav oligarchy deployed biological weapons against Earth colonies. 3 colonies, 14,000 people lost. And then within 4 months, the Krav military had no remaining capability, and their civilian population was untouched." "Yes," I said. "How?" "Precisely," I said. She waited. She was good at waiting, not the impatient waiting of someone managing themselves, but the genuine waiting of someone who understood that some answers come in their own time and cannot be pulled out faster than they are ready to arrive. "The Krav thought the way most aggressive civilizations think," I said. "They assumed that a target capable of hurting them was also a target that could be broken by hurting it first. Hit them hard enough and fast enough, and they will not have time to respond effectively. It works, often, against most targets." I paused. "It does not work against Earth, because Earth's response to being hurt is not to stop what it is doing. It is to do it harder and faster, and with more focus, because now it is personal." That sounds like a very dangerous quality to have. "It is," I said, "for everyone involved, including us. We have had to learn, over 60 years, how to aim it. An unaimed response is just destruction. An aimed response is a conclusion. And the Krav response? We removed their ability to project force beyond their own home system, left everything else intact. Then we sent a message. The one that said, 'Do not.'" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The corridor around us was empty. The diplomatic complex was running on its own kind of exhausted tension, with people sleeping in shifts, and the lights kept dim for the species that needed darkness to rest. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer me honestly, not diplomatically." "All right." "Is what you are proposing actually possible?" she asked. "Not as a strategy, not as a plan. Actually possible. 47 Urveth vessels. Can you do it?" I looked at the wall across from me, at the smooth stone of the Velkarath complex, 300 years old, built by a civilization that had been planning for the long future when they laid the first foundation stone. The honest answer, I said, is that I do not know for certain. The mechanism I intend to use was designed for a single target. Scaling it to 47 simultaneous targets involves variables that cannot be fully modeled until the moment it is deployed. The calculations Alara is running suggest it is achievable. But calculations are models, and the universe has a history of not cooperating with models. And if it does not work, then we shift to a different approach, and that approach is significantly louder and considerably more expensive for everyone. Including your ship. Including my ship. She absorbed this. Her expression did not change in the way most people's expressions change when they receive information they find frightening. The visible flinch, the pull toward reassurance. She sat with it. I will tell you something I have not told anyone in that crisis chamber, she said. The Sereth Dominion has intelligence files on the Urveth. Not historical records. Recent ones. They were observed 2 years ago in a system 400 light-years from here. Our analysts assessed the sighting as a low-probability threat and reclassified it as an unverified anomaly. She paused. I read that report. I disagreed with the reclassification. I was told the risk was manageable and that raising it formally would cause unnecessary concern among allied civilizations. You were told to be quiet about it. I was advised to be measured in my concerns, she said, which is the same thing with better language. You should have pushed harder. I know, she said simply. No defensiveness. Just acknowledgement. What would you have done? I would have pushed until someone listened or until I had enough evidence to make them listen, I said. And if neither of those worked, I would have started preparing for the thing to arrive anyway, because prepared is more useful than right. Is that what you did? Prepare? I have been preparing for something like this for most of my career, I said. Not specifically the Urveth, just something that every early warning system eventually finds, if it is looking in the right directions. And Earth has an early warning system. Earth has several, I said. The cluster's registered communication and surveillance network is not one of them. She stared at me. You have your own surveillance network. In this cluster, without telling anyone. We are new here, I said. New things pay attention. For the first time since I had met her, Princess Selvara looked at me with something that was not condescension, not curiosity, not the careful assessment of a commander evaluating an unfamiliar variable. She looked at me with something that was much closer to respect. Not comfortable respect, the uncomfortable kind. The kind you feel for something that has just revealed itself to be considerably more complex than you had assumed. You walked into that hall in dress grays with a single iron stripe, she said. You let every delegation in that room think you were peripheral. You let me... She stopped. Say what you said, I supplied. Yes, she said. And it was deliberate. Deliberate. I agreed. Not malicious. But deliberate. Deliberate, I said again, because the most useful position in a room full of people who are making assumptions is the one where they are making the wrong assumption about you. It gives you time to understand the room before the room understands you. She thought about this. I would like to not be someone who makes the wrong assumption about you, she said. You are already halfway there, I said. You asked the honest question. That is halfway. At hour 16, Alara's calculations came back. I was in the communications room when she delivered them, and I read them twice before I said anything. Then I sat with them for a while longer, going through the modeling assumptions, checking the variables she had flagged as uncertain, thinking about the places where the model and the actual situation might diverge. The result was not a certainty, but it was close enough to attempt. One condition, Alara said. Tell me. The suppression effect requires 8 minutes of continuous operation. During those 8 minutes, the Urveth will know what is happening. They will attempt to interfere, both from the scout vessel locally and potentially from the main fleet at the system boundary. We cannot maintain the suppression array and simultaneously defend against both. So we need something to keep them looking elsewhere for 8 minutes. Yes, something large enough and active enough to hold their attention fully. I thought about the Sarath Vale fleet. 8 ships, perfectly drilled. A commander who did not panic. I have something in mind, I said. I expected you would. The device, I said. If it does not reach full effect by the end of the 8 minutes, if the coverage is not complete, what happens? Partial effect, she said. The ships that are fully within the suppression radius when it terminates will be neutralized. The ones at the edges will be affected to varying degrees. Some may retain partial function. And a partially functional Urveth vessel is still a significant threat, she said. Which is why the 8 minutes are non-negotiable. She confirmed. I opened a channel to Selvara. She answered immediately. I could hear from the background that she was on the bridge of her flagship, which meant she had transferred her command operations from the surface at some point in the last few hours. She had moved herself closer to the action without being asked. I have the calculations, I said. I need to explain a plan. It requires your fleet. A very brief pause. I am listening. What I need your ships to do is dangerous, I said. I will not minimize that. What I am asking is for your fleet to operate in close proximity to a very hostile object for 8 minutes, while taking whatever that object can direct at them, and to do so without withdrawing and without losing formation, because if the formation breaks, the effect I am trying to create collapses. Another brief pause. Longer this time. 8 minutes, she said. 8 minutes. What is the threat projection for my ships? Honest answer. Significant. The Urveth scout vessel's offensive capability is not fully modeled. We do not have complete data on its weapons systems. So you are asking me to put my ships into an engagement with incomplete information? Yes, I said. The pause this time was longer still, long enough that I wondered whether the answer would be no, and thought about what I would do if it was no, and came up with very few satisfying alternatives. All right, she said. You do not need more time to consider it. I considered it while you were explaining, she said. If I say no, what happens to the civilizations in this conclave? I said nothing. I thought so, she said. I will need the exact timing. And I will need your ship to be in communication with mine throughout. If something changes, I need to know in real time. Ilara will maintain an open channel to your bridge, I said. Ilara, she repeated. That is the name of your ship. Yes. Does your ship have a name because Earth gives names to its vessels, or because this particular ship chose one? I smiled. I could not help it. The second one. A sound on her end that might have been a quiet exhale of something not quite laughter. Very well, she said. When do we begin? I checked the timeline. 38 hours remaining on the Urveth ultimatum, which meant 38 hours before they concluded that the answer was no, and responded accordingly. But Ilara's monitoring of the scout vessel's communication patterns had shown a gradual increase in frequency, short bursts back to the main fleet, getting closer together, the kind of pattern that precedes a decision. I do not think we have 38 hours, I said. How long do we have? Ilara's estimate is 18 to 22 hours before the scout's pattern shift indicates they are no longer waiting for a diplomatic response. Then we begin in 16, she said. Give me time to brief my crews. 16 hours, I agreed. I closed the channel and opened the one to Kethal, who was, at this hour, almost certainly not sleeping. I was right. He answered immediately, his voice alert, the voice of a person who has been awake with his thoughts. I need you to be somewhere specific in 16 hours, I said. Where? The observation platform on the north tower of the complex. Bring your recording equipment. A pause. Why the observation platform? Because, I said, you have spent your career cataloging things that governments prefer to forget. In 16 hours, you are going to have something to catalog that no one will be able to forget, and I would like someone to record it properly. What is going to happen? I thought about how to answer that, about the 47 ships at the system boundary, about the scout vessel above the pole, about the 8-minute window, and the suppression device, and the Serath fleet holding formation under fire, and Ilara moving through angles that physics technically permitted, but politely discouraged. Something, I said, that will change where Earth sits in this conclave. I heard him begin moving before I had finished the sentence. The Urveth did not wait 18 hours. They moved at hour 14. Ilara caught it first, a shift in the scout vessel's communication pattern that she had been monitoring for 15 hours. The tight rhythmic pulses suddenly going irregular, spreading out, becoming something more like a broadcast than a report. She flagged it and woke me from the 2 hours of sleep I had managed, her voice calm and without apology, because we had an arrangement about unnecessary apologies. Pattern shift, she said. The scout is not reporting to the main fleet anymore. It is signaling to it. The distinction matters. Reporting is information passing. Signaling is instruction passing. I was already moving. What is the instruction? Based on what our sensors can read of the carrier frequency. Advance. I had the channel to Selvara open before Alara finished the sentence. She was already awake. I could hear it in her voice. Not the slightly slow quality of someone called from sleep, but the alert, compressed quality of someone who had not slept and had been waiting. I know, she said. My sensors caught it 30 seconds after yours. We are 4 hours ahead of my worst-case estimate. I know that too. My fleet is ready. They have been ready for 6 hours. A pause. My people are good, Darren. It was the first time she had used my name. Not Sergeant Major, not Terran. My name. I know they are, I said. Tell me exactly what you need. I told her. The formation. A moving wedge, not a static defensive line, because a static target is easier to engage than a moving one, and we needed the Urveth scouts' attention fully committed to tracking 8 ships in active maneuvering. The communication protocol, Ilara's channel to her bridge, would carry real-time updates as the suppression device built toward full effect. The most important instruction, which I said twice, because it needed to be clear, and because there was no version of this where it being unclear was acceptable. Do not withdraw, I said. Whatever happens to individual ships, do not break formation, and do not withdraw until I give the word. If the formation breaks, the device loses its coverage radius, and we lose the window. And if the window is lost, she asked. Then we do this the other way, I said, and the other way is worse for everyone. Understood. A moment. How will I know if the device is working? Ilara will give you a countdown. When she reaches 0, it is done. Until then, hold. Hold, she repeated, as though confirming the word to herself. All right, hold. I switched channels. Ilara, position. Behind the second moon, in a holding arc. I need 3 minutes to reach optimal deployment range once I begin moving. When the Sereth fleet engages, begin your approach. Do not activate the device until you are inside deployment range. Understood. A pause. The main fleet is moving. The Urveth fleet. All 47 ships. They are leaving the system boundary. I closed my eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Not praying. Not afraid. Just centering. The 2-second thing I had learned many years ago from a person I respected very much, who had taught it to me by demonstrating it so reliably that I eventually asked about it. She had said that 2 seconds of stillness before action is the difference between responding and reacting, and that everything you have ever prepared for lives in those 2 seconds, waiting for you to access it calmly. Then I opened my eyes and went to work. The crisis chamber was already filling when I arrived. The Velkarath Arbiter was present, along with his full advisory staff. Drath Ven Cole was there in armor, standing because the Muralax rarely sit when they are preparing for action. Sitting, in their physiology, is something you do when the danger has passed. The Dreth Ambassador was there, small and still in the corner, watching everything with the dense, focused attention of a species that had evolved to be very good at staying alive, in environments full of things that wanted to eat them. Selvara was not there. She was on her flagship, where she needed to be. The central display showed the scanner data, which was now showing 47 large objects moving from the system boundary, in a formation that the Velkarath tactical system flagged as approach configuration. The system also displayed in a smaller data panel the combined fleet's positioning, the Muralax iron ships, the Velkarath defense platforms, the remaining Serath vessels that were not in Selvara's active wedge. 306 ships against 47. The numbers looked better than they were. The Urveth vessels were significantly larger, significantly more capable in terms of raw energy output, and were operating from a baseline of 400 years of unchallenged existence, during which nothing in the known galaxy had successfully resisted them. The Arbiter looked at me when I walked in. His expression was not the careful diplomatic neutrality he had maintained through the session and the crisis chamber meetings. It was older than that. Behind the controlled face of a 300-year administrator was the face of something much more fundamental, a living being looking at a danger it did not know how to address, reaching the end of what experience had prepared it for. "Sergeant Major Voss," he said, "the fleet is moving." "Yes. Our combined military response is, the projections are not favorable," I said. "I know. Then what are we doing?" I looked at the display. The 47 objects moving in their cold formation, unhurried, the way something moves when it has never been given a reason to hurry. "We are doing something different," I said. I opened the communications panel on the crisis chamber table, broadcasting on the Urveth frequency, the same one their scout had been using, the one our systems had been monitoring and partially decoding for 14 hours. I did not use Galactic Standard. I used a constructed signal built from patterns extracted from their own communications, which Alara had been preparing since hour 6. The message was simple, in their own pattern structure. 3 concepts, in sequence. "We see you. We refuse. We respond." The room went very still when I sent it. The Velkarath advisors stared at the panel. Drath Ven Cole turned from the display to look at me. The Dreth ambassador made a sound I had not heard a Dreth make before. "You just provoked them," said one of the Velkarath advisors. "I just told them the truth," I said. "There is a difference." The response from the Urveth scout came in 11 seconds. It was long, much longer than their previous communications, and the translation system worked on it for 40 seconds before producing output. What it said was essentially this: "We acknowledge resistance. We note that the species called Terran has issued a refusal response on behalf of the full population cluster. We are recording this. We are calculating." Then the scout went quiet. And then Alara said, through the channel I had left open on speaker, "They are focusing their long-range sensors on me." The room heard that. Every face turned toward the speaker. "Specifically on me," Alara repeated. "Not on the Serath fleet. Not on the Muralax formation. On me. They identified my vessel, and they are scanning it in detail." A pause. "They are taking longer than I would have expected. They are running their scans multiple times." "What does that mean?" asked the Arbiter. "It means," I said, "that they are finding things their models did not expect." I looked at the display. "Ilara, begin approach." "Moving now," she said. What happened in the next 40 minutes was the kind of thing that is very difficult to describe to someone who was not there, because the experience of it was split between the utterly vast scale of what was happening in space above the planet and the very intimate, compressed experience of being in a room full of people who were watching it on a display table and trying to keep their thinking clear under the weight of it. The Serath wedge formation hit the Urveth scout vessel at full acceleration. 8 ships, moving together with the kind of precision that comes from years of drilling the same maneuver until it is not a thought anymore, but a reflex. The scout responded immediately, and its response confirmed what our models had suggested about its offensive capability. It was powerful. The energy discharges it produced were in a class above anything the cluster's combined fleet had in its current inventory. The first exchange of the engagement took one of Selvara's ships off the line, drive systems compromised, the crew alive, but the ship no longer capable of maintaining formation. 7 ships now. On the display, Ilara's position showed her emerging from behind the second moon and pushing toward the deployment radius, at a velocity that required the tactical system to update its position markers twice per second to keep pace. The Urveth main fleet, meanwhile, had slowed its advance. The 47 ships were still moving, but had reduced their approach speed. Ilara's assessment of the reason: the scout's sensor readings of her had generated data that did not match the fleet's existing models for Terran vessels, or for anything they had previously catalogued, and the fleet was waiting for the scout to resolve the discrepancy before committing to full advance. That was the variable I had been counting on. Not certain, not in any model, but it was consistent with how entities that have never faced serious resistance behave when they first encounter something that does not conform to their expectations. They slow down. They reassess. They are not afraid. They have no reason to be afraid. Not yet. But they are deliberate, because they are not creatures that waste effort, and applying full advance force before the situation is clear is a waste of effort. The scout being occupied with the Serath fleet gave Ilara 4 additional minutes of approach time. She used every second. In the crisis chamber, I watched the position display and ran the timing in my head. Elara was 90 seconds from deployment range. The Sarath fleet was holding 6 ships now, the second casualty having taken damage severe enough to require withdrawal, which I had told Selvara to allow if the alternative was the crew being lost. She had authorized individual withdrawal for severely damaged ships while maintaining overall formation integrity with the remaining vessels. 5 ships now holding the engagement. Still holding. "Selvara," I said over the open channel. "Still here," she said. Her voice was steady. The background on her bridge was not. I could hear the sound of a ship in active combat, the alarms and system reports and the physical impact of the engagement translating into vibration through the hull. 3 minutes, I said. "Understood." A pause. Then, privately, not broadcast to the room, "Darren, 2 of my ships are in serious trouble. Can they hold 3 minutes?" A long moment. "Yes," she said. "We will hold." "I will not forget this," I said. "I know," she said. "Do not waste the time talking about it." I turned back to the display. Elara reached deployment range at the moment the Urveth main fleet increased its approach speed again. The scout had apparently communicated enough for the fleet to decide that delay was no longer productive. 47 ships, accelerating. The combined cluster fleet moved to intercept, forming a line between the fleet and the planet below. 306 ships against 47, and the math still did not favor the cluster. "Elara," I said, "deploy." "Deploying now," she said. 8 minutes from this moment. Countdown running. What the suppression device was. Technically, I have never fully explained to anyone outside of Earth's relevant departments, and I will not attempt to explain it here in any precise way. What I can say is this. It was the product of what Earth had learned from 12 years of studying the Krath swarm, from understanding how a distributed collective intelligence maintains its coordination across thousands of individual nodes, and from reverse engineering the principles of that coordination well enough to produce a signal that disrupted it at its fundamental level. The Urveth were not the Krath. They were different in many ways, but they shared one critical characteristic. The 47 ships of their fleet were not operating independently. They were coordinated by a collective communication system, and that system operated on principles that the Krath had also used, because some solutions are so efficient that multiple forms of intelligence arrive at them independently. The device produced a signal that those principles could not accommodate, a frequency that their coordination system could not process and could not ignore, like a voice speaking directly into the mechanism that allows an orchestra to stay in time together, saying something that made time impossible. 7 minutes. The Urveth main fleet hit the cluster's defensive line. The engagement was significant and immediate and brutal, in the way that things are brutal when 2 forces with very different capability levels make contact. Ships on both sides took damage. Muralax iron ships, which were built with survivability as their primary design principle, absorbed hits that would have destroyed lighter vessels and kept functioning. The Velkarath defense platforms returned fire with everything they had. The Sarath vessels not in Selvara's wedge wove through the engagement with the precision that was their signature. 6 minutes. The Urveth fleet began adjusting its formation mid-engagement. Not because they were losing. They were not losing in any direct sense, but because their sensors had located Elara, and they had assessed her as the source of the anomalous signal building in the system. 3 of the 47 ships broke from the main engagement and oriented toward her. "I have 3 vessels attempting to intercept," Elara said. Her voice was the same as always. "Can you maintain deployment and maneuver for approximately 4 more minutes before they reach effective engagement range? Then maneuver." What Elara did for the next 4 minutes is the part of this engagement that I know will end up in the archive that Kethal was recording from the observation tower, and I know it will be described in terms that make it sound like the ship was performing something extraordinary. From a technical standpoint, it was. The angles of approach and withdrawal she was executing were at the edge of what the drives were rated for, and the timing precision required to hold the suppression array active while simultaneously avoiding 3 pursuing vessels was not something that can be modeled simply. But from Elara's perspective, I think it was just work. The same kind of careful, focused work she had always done. She is not dramatic about what she is capable of. She just does it. 3 minutes. The crisis chamber had gone very quiet. The arbiter was standing at the edge of the display table, both hands flat on its surface, watching. Drath Ven Kol had stopped moving entirely, the Muralax stillness of total attention. Even the young Velkarath advisor who had said the word impossible the night before was just watching, the word apparently having revised itself somewhere in the back of his mind. 2 minutes. One of the pursuing Urveth vessels reached engagement range. The impact on Alara's hull registered on the display, a brief flare in her position icon, a data note from her systems. Armor integrity reduced, all primary systems maintained, suppression array active. Still here, she said. Unnecessary but appreciated. 1 minute. Selvara's voice on the channel, and she was not steady anymore. Not panicked. Nothing like panic, but the very controlled voice of someone who has been holding something extremely heavy for a long time, and has nearly reached the point where they can set it down. Tell me we are close. 1 minute, I said. A sound from her end. Not words. Something else. 30 seconds. The suppression array's effect at full coverage is not visible in any dramatic sense. There is no flash, no explosion, no visible wave of energy moving outward from the source. What happens is a change in the way things sound, because what stops is the coordinated communication, and the absence of that coordination means the noise of the individual ships, which had been organized into purposeful motion, becomes random, and randomness sounds different from intention. What the display showed, at the 0 mark, was 47 large objects that had been moving in coordinated formation, suddenly becoming 47 large objects, moving in 47 different, unrelated directions. Not quickly. The physics of their momentum carried them forward for another several seconds. But there was no more intention behind the motion, no coordination, no Urveth fleet, just 47 ships of considerable size, their drives still running but their direction finding no longer coherent, drifting in the slow, aimless way of something that has stopped knowing what it is trying to do. The crisis chamber erupted. I did not erupt. I stood at the display and watched the data, waited for Alara's full report, made sure the thing was done before I treated it as done, because the single most dangerous moment in any operation is the moment when you assume the outcome before it is confirmed. Coverage complete, Alara said. All 47 vessels neutralized. The coordination system is non-functional. Individual vessel drives remain active but without directional intent. They will drift. The scout vessel above the pole has also gone dark. It was within the deployment radius. Crew status? I asked. I am fine, she said. Minor hull damage. All systems nominal. I let out a breath. Then I picked up the communications channel to Selvara's flagship. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of a ship no longer under active engagement, the alarms gone quiet, the impact sounds absent, the particular quality of silence that a hull takes on when the pressure against it has stopped. Then her voice. Is it done? It is done, I said. Another silence. Longer. I lost 4 ships, she said. I did not say I was sorry. That is not what she needed, and it is not what I meant. What I said was, tell me their names. She told me. All 4 ship names, the full designations, without consulting a list. She knew them without looking. They will be in the archive, I said. Every name. Good, she said, very quietly. I looked at the display. 47 objects drifting. The cluster's combined fleet still in formation. The engagement stopped so suddenly that many of the ships had not yet updated their maneuvering to account for the absence of opponents. 306 ships, plus 1 small, unregistered Terran vessel, and between them, the remains of the thing that had been a nightmare in this region of the galaxy for 400 years. In the crisis chamber, the Velkarath arbiter was standing very straight and very still, and when he looked at me differently than he had looked at me at any point since I had walked into his hall with my single iron stripe and my flask. He did not say anything. There was nothing in his 300-year catalog of diplomatic language that quite fit the moment. That was all right. I did not need him to say anything. I picked up my flask, took a slow drink, and started thinking about what came next. The silence that followed the end of the engagement lasted longer than you would expect silence to last in a room full of beings for whom noise is a natural state. Then the Velkarath arbiter sat down in his chair at the head of the table, the slow, deliberate movement of someone whose legs have decided that standing is no longer an appropriate response to the current moment. And he looked at the display, which was still showing 47 drifting objects in the space above his world, and he said nothing for almost 2 full minutes. I let him have the silence. I have found, over the years, that the moments when powerful people are genuinely quiet are the most productive moments to have been in the same room with them, because it means the performance has stopped, and you are getting something real. What finally broke the silence was not the arbiter. It was the Dreth ambassador, who had been standing in the corner for the entire engagement. Small, precise, unmoved in the way that creatures move who have learned that stillness is survival, and who now said, in galactic standard, in a voice that was entirely steady, "We owe you an accounting." I looked at him. He was looking at me directly, which in Dreth body language is a significant gesture. The Dreth are not a species that looks directly at things unless they have made a decision about them. "You do not owe me anything," I said. "I moved my chair," he said, "on the first day." "I know." "That action reflected an assumption," he said. "The assumption was wrong. I would like to acknowledge that clearly." The room had gone quiet again, but differently this time. The stunned quality was fading, replaced by something more alert, the attention of people who are beginning to understand that the thing they have been watching has implications that extend beyond the immediate event. Drath Ven Cole, who had been standing at the display since the engagement began, finally sat down. He placed his large hands on the table with a controlled heaviness and looked at them for a moment. Then he looked at me. "The calculations my tactical officers ran when the Urveth fleet advanced," he said, "gave the combined cluster fleet a 12% probability of survival. Full engagement. 12%. That sounds about right," I said. "And one unregistered Terran vessel changed that outcome entirely." "One unregistered Terran vessel," I agreed, "and 8 Sereth ships whose crew held a position they had every reason to leave." Something moved in Drath Ven Cole's expression, the specific quality of a warrior recognizing something. The Muralax culture is organized around a concept they call the Iron Choice, the moment when a warrior chooses to stand in a place from which it would be easier and safer to walk away. They honor it deeply. They carve it into the walls of their military halls. He was recognizing it now, in the Sereth fleet that had held its formation under fire to give Alara the 8 minutes she needed. "The Sereth ships," he said. "How many did we lose?" 4, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Those crews will be recognized by the Muralax Iron Pact. Formally, whatever the Sereth Dominion considers its highest honors for the fallen, we would like to add ours." I nodded. "Tell Selvara that yourself. She will appreciate hearing it from you directly." An hour after the engagement ended, Kethal came down from the observation tower. He found me in the corridor outside the communications room, the same corridor where we had talked before. He was carrying his recording equipment, and he looked like a person who had just witnessed something that had been living in his imagination for 30 years and turned out to be larger than the imagination had room for. He sat down against the wall without ceremony and looked at the floor for a moment. "I have the full recording," he said. "The engagement from first contact to neutralization. Full sensor data, visual capture, communication logs." He paused. "It is the most complete record of a single military action in cluster history." "Good," I said. "I also need to ask you something," he said. "Ask." "The device your ship used," he said carefully. "The suppression system. You said after the Reach 9 incident that there was a mechanism, but no one could identify it. 14 years ago, the classified files noted that whatever was used against the Krath Overmind was of Terran origin, but could not be reverse engineered because we did not have enough data." He looked at me. "You have just used a version of it against 47 Urveth vessels simultaneously. The data from this engagement will give every analytical team in the cluster far more to work with." "Yes," I said. "You know that." "Yes." "You chose to use it anyway, knowing it would reveal more." "I chose to use it because it was necessary," I said. "The intelligence implication was secondary, but not absent from your consideration." I looked at him. Kethal was the kind of person who asks the question behind the question, not to catch you out, but because he genuinely wants to understand the full structure of a thing, not just the visible surface. "It was not absent," I said. "The moment had come for the cluster to know more about what Earth actually is. The alternative was to keep being peripheral and watch what just happened happen anyway, which would have been worse. So yes, This serves both purposes. But the reason I used it was the first one. He nodded slowly. I want to show you something, he said. He opened his recording device and pulled up a section of the visual capture from the observation tower. It showed the space above the planet, the engagement in progress, the drifting shapes of the Urveth ships, the Serath formation, the impossible angles of Alara's movement through the engagement zone. He had it time-locked on a specific moment. The instant the suppression device reached full effect. The instant the 47 ships stopped being a coordinated force. Watch, he said. At that moment, on the full-spectrum sensor overlay he had running alongside the visual, something was visible that I had not been watching for in real time. A ripple. A wave-like distortion in the electromagnetic background of the system, spreading outward from Alara's position at the moment of full suppression. It was subtle, the kind of thing you would miss in the urgency of the engagement itself, but which stood out clearly in a recorded review with full sensor data. What causes that? He asked. The device creates a suppression field by introducing a specific pattern into the local electromagnetic environment, I said. The ripple is a side effect of the field collapsing once its function is complete. What it looks like, Kethal said slowly, on the full-spectrum recording, what it looks like is a pulse that spread outward at several times the speed of light. I said nothing. That is not possible, he said. Within known physics, that is not possible. A lot of things that are not possible within known physics, I said carefully, become possible when you study the right phenomena for long enough and ask different questions than the ones that established the known physics in the first place. He looked at me for a very long time. Earth has been spacefaring for 62 years, he said. Yes. And in 62 years, you have produced technology that... We had good teachers, I said. What teachers? You have been isolated in your star system for... Not teachers from outside, I said. Our own history, our own mistakes. When something goes very wrong very fast, and you survive it, you learn differently than you learn from gradual progress. Earth's early spacefaring period had several moments that were, I paused, clarifying. He absorbed this. Clarifying, he said. We lost people, I said. In the early years, we made assumptions about what was out here, and we were wrong, and we paid for being wrong. And then we stopped making those assumptions, and we started paying very close attention instead. That is why you have a surveillance network that the cluster does not know about. That is why we watch, I said, not because we distrust the cluster's civilization specifically, because we learned that the universe does not warn you before it shows you what it is actually capable of, and we decided we would rather find things before they found us. Kethal looked at the recording again, at the ripple spreading outward from Alara's position. The classification I intend to recommend for Terra in the formal archive, he said, is Active Apex Entity, Observation Priority 1. I want you to know that before I submit it. I appreciate the notice, I said. There will be resistance to it, he said. The Vel'Karath have a very established sense of who belongs at the center of things and who belongs at the periphery. Reclassifying Terra this dramatically will require them to accept that their seating chart is wrong, I said. Yes, I know. That is all right. They will accept it eventually. You are not concerned about the political implications? I am always concerned about the political implications, I said. Concern is useful. Paralysis is not. I paused. The cluster needed to know what it is dealing with on the Urveth question. That knowledge now includes what Earth is capable of. Both of those things are better handled in the open than managed in the shadows. We are past the point where being peripheral serves us. He nodded, closed the recording device, looked at me with the expression of someone who has been in an archive for 30 years and has just watched the most significant document he will ever process arrive and land in the present tense. What happens to the Urveth ships? He asked. They are safe to approach in their current state, I said. The suppression neutralized the coordinating intelligence. The individual ships have mechanical systems still running, but no guidance. Boarding teams can access them. I paused. I would recommend a joint mission. Terran technical staff with whatever the cluster can provide, understanding what those ships are made of, how they function, what their capabilities actually were. That information belongs to everyone who just had to face them. A joint mission, he said. Earth sharing technical intelligence with the cluster. The cluster just held a defensive line while my ship ran past it, I said. That is worth something. He almost smiled. You are going to be an interesting presence in the conclave, he said. Going forward. I expect so, I said. He left, and I sat in the corridor for a while longer, and did the thing I always do after an operation. Went through it from beginning to end in my mind, not to relive it, but to look for the things I had missed. The variables that had not been in the model. The moments where something had been close to going differently. There were several. There always are. The 2 hours of early advance by the Urveth fleet that had compressed the timeline. The third ship that reached Alara's engagement range before the suppression was complete. The moment in Selvara's voice when I had known, without being told, that 2 of her ships were in serious trouble, and she had answered yes, to holding them anyway. That last one stayed with me. I was thinking about it, about what it costs a commander to order a crew to hold a position that is actively damaging their ship, and about what kind of person makes that order clearly, and keeps their voice steady while they make it. When the door at the end of the corridor opened, and Selvara walked in. She was not in armor. For the first time since the conclave began, she was wearing the Sereth equivalent of civilian clothes. A long, dark garment, with the silver thread detailing of the Dominion's ruling family worked into the collar and cuffs. Without the armor, she was less physically imposing, but somehow more present. The armor was a role. This was the person. She had been crying. Not recently. She had the controlled composure of someone who had cried privately and efficiently, and then cleaned their face and done what needed to be done. But the traces were there, if you knew how to look. I did not comment on it. It was not mine to comment on. She sat across from me. For a moment she did not speak, and I did not speak either, because the silence was doing something useful. It was marking the distance between what had just happened and whatever would come next, giving it the space it deserved. 41 people, she said finally, across the 4 ships, 41 crew. Yes, I said. I knew some of them personally, commanders I had trained with, officers who had been on my flagship. She looked at her hands. I gave the order to hold, knowing what it might cost. It was the right order, I said.
Yes,
She said.
it was the right order.
She paused.
Knowing that it was right does not make the weight of it lighter.
No, I agreed. It doesn't. The weight is the weight. You carry it. She looked at me. You have done this before. Many times. And the weight accumulates, I said. There is no trick for that. You just carry more of it over time. What changes is not the weight, but your ability to walk with it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, how do you keep walking? I thought about how to answer that honestly, which is the only way I know how to answer things. Because the alternative, I said, is to stop making the hard calls. And if you stop making the hard calls, you get outcomes like what this conclave was about to do before you and I had this argument in a corridor 2 days ago. Someone else carries the weight instead. Someone who did not choose it, and was not prepared for it, and does not know how. She thought about that. When I ridiculed you in the hall, she said, You were wrong, I said, and you know it, and you do not need to keep explaining it. I want to, she said. I want to explain it, because it matters to me that you understand what I was thinking. I was not cruel. I was comfortable. I was in a room where everything confirmed what I already believed about the order of things. And you were a data point that did not fit, and I handled that by fitting you into the wrong category. The peripheral delegate from the newly emerged species, I said. Yes, and now I know what that category actually cost me, in terms of understanding. She paused. I do not want to operate from that kind of comfort anymore. It was one of the most honest things I had heard from someone in a position of genuine power. Most people in positions of power do not have the specific courage required to examine the things they were comfortable with and find them wanting. It is much easier to reframe the evidence than to revise the assumption. Then don't, I said simply. Just don't. Yes. Just decide not to, and then do the work of not doing it. Every time you notice it happening. It is not complicated. It is just consistent. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something I had not expected. I would like to know you better, she said. Not Terran relations with the Sereth Dominion. Not the Alliance proposal. Just you. What 62 years of Earth's history actually looks like from inside it. What you have done and seen and what you understand about it." She paused. "Is that an unusual request?" "A little," I said. "I do not care." I looked at her. The violet iridescence of her skin had dimmed slightly in the low light of the corridor. Sereth coloration is partly responsive to emotional state, and what it was showing now was something quieter and less performed than anything I had seen from her since the conclave began. "I have time," I said. "The next formal session is not for 6 hours. Alara is handling the technical communication with the boarding preparation teams." I paused. "If you want to know what 62 years looks like from inside it, I can tell you." "Yes," she said. "I do." I leaned back against the stone wall, thought about where to start. And then I started from the beginning. Earth's first 12 years in space were not what anyone who has lived through the clean version of it in history lessons would expect. I told Selvara this. I told her in the corridor with the stone walls around us and the 3 sons of Velkarath moving through their separate journeys, somewhere above the complex's ceiling. And I told her the way you tell something that you have carried for a long time to someone who has just demonstrated they can be trusted with the actual weight of it. The first 12 years were chaos, not the romantic kind of chaos that gets written into founding myths. The real kind, the kind that comes from a species that had spent most of its history on a single world, which is a very small stage with very clear edges, suddenly finding itself in something with no edges at all. We were not ready. No one who has only ever lived in a room is ready for the outside of the building, no matter how much they have read about it. We made mistakes that cost lives. We made contact with civilizations before we understood them well enough to do it safely. We had encounters that went wrong in ways that we did not have the context to interpret or the vocabulary to resolve. We lost people in the gaps between what we expected and what was actually there. What we did not do was stop. That is the thing that most cluster civilizations, when they first study Earth's early spacefaring period, find the most difficult to understand. Because the rational response to a new environment that is actively showing you how unprepared you are is to pause, consolidate, reassess. Limit your exposure until you have built your knowledge base to the point where engagement is safer. We did not do that either. We pushed into the gaps. We went back to the places where things had gone wrong and figured out why they had gone wrong. We developed protocols from the failures rather than from the theories, because failures are real data and theories are educated guesses, and we had learned, very quickly, that the educated guesses our best people produced were still inadequate for a universe that did not have an obligation to match human expectations. The result, after 62 years, was a civilization that was simultaneously younger than anything else in the cluster and, in certain very specific ways, more experienced than most of it. Not more powerful necessarily, not richer or more extensive, but with a particular kind of knowledge that comes from having failed in the dangerous zone and survived and learned from the survival. Selvara listened to all of this without interrupting. She was a good listener, genuinely so, which is rarer than people imagine in those who are accustomed to being in rooms where people listen to them. She asked questions at the right moments, the questions that indicated she was tracking not just what I was saying but what it meant. What it implied about how Earth saw the universe, and why that produced the behaviors that had confused and startled the conclave so completely. "The surveillance network," she said, at one point. "You described it as something you developed because you learned to watch rather than wait. But that is a significant resource investment for a species 62 years into space travel. How did you sustain the priority?" It was a good question, a leadership question, which told me something about how she thinks. 2 answers. I said. The first is that Earth has a particular institutional relationship with what we call the long argument, the idea that the most important reasons to do something expensive are the ones that will not become obvious until after you have stopped being able to afford the decision. Our political structures are imperfect, but they have preserved, through significant difficulty, the ability to make investments whose payoff takes decades to arrive. And the second answer? We were shown, early on, what it costs not to watch, I said, once. Clearly enough that it did not require repetition. She did not ask what the showing had been. She looked at my face and read something there that told her the answer was not the kind of thing you push for, and she moved on, which was another mark in her favor. We talked for 3 hours. By the end of it, the corridor's ambient lighting had shifted to the warmer tone that the Velkarath complex used for the late-night period. and the sounds of the diplomatic complex had settled into the quieter register of a building operating on its nighttime protocols. She stood up to leave, and then paused. "I want to formally propose something," she said. "Not in the conclave. Between us, first, before it is a diplomatic event. Propose it. An alliance between the Sereth Dominion and Terra," she said. "Mutual defense. Full navigation rights in each other's territory. Open intelligence sharing. Real intelligence, not the curated kind that goes through 12 layers of diplomatic processing before it resembles the actual truth." She paused. "And I want a joint mission to understand the Urveth ships. Not managed through a committee. A direct joint operation between Sereth and Terran technical teams." "That is a substantial proposal," I said. "Yes. The Sereth Dominion has existing alliance structures with several cluster civilizations. Adding Terra on those terms would require renegotiation of some of those arrangements." "I know. Your advisory council will object to at least 4 provisions of what you have described." "My advisory council," she said, with the precise quality of someone who has thought about this already, "advises me. They do not decide for me." I looked at her. She met the look without moving. "There are things about Earth's capabilities that I cannot share with the Dominion," I said. "Some will never be shareable. Some will take time and demonstrated trust to share. A real alliance means being honest about that, rather than allowing you to discover it later."
"I appreciate the honesty," she said.
"And there will be moments when Earth's way of handling things will not match the Dominion's way of handling things. And I would rather we agree now that those moments require direct conversation, rather than the kind of diplomatic distance that lets a misunderstanding become a problem before anyone has addressed it." "Agreed," she said. "Then I will contact Earth," I said. "They will want to respond formally, which will take time, but I can tell you, based on what I know of the current thinking in our government, that the answer will be yes." "You are confident in that?" "The Sereth Dominion has been on our close watch list for 15 years, I said. "Not as a threat, as a potential." Her expression shifted. "You watch potential allies the same way you watch threats." "We watch everything," I said, "but we watch them differently. Threats we watch for capability and intent. Potentials we watch for character. What a civilization does when it is under pressure, whether its leaders make the hard call or the comfortable one." I paused. "Your Dominion has been making hard calls consistently for 90 years. And today, your ships held a position they could have left, on the word of a man your princess had mocked at dinner, because the alternative was to let the cluster pay the price for their withdrawal." She was quiet for a moment. "I did not mock you at dinner," she said. "It was in the main hall, at the opening session. You sent me a note on silk parchment, suggesting I might need charitable protection. That was also at the opening session." "You are correct," I said. "It was not at dinner. I apologize for the imprecision." Something happened in her expression then, a full, genuine thing that she did not contain in time. Not quite a smile, something better than a smile. The look of a person who has been carrying the weight of a formal occasion for a very long time and has just had it lifted, slightly, by something absurd and small and entirely human. "Good night, Sergeant Major Voss," she said. "Good night, Your Highness." She left. I sat in the corridor for a few more minutes, finished the last of my flask, and then went to find a bed, because I had been awake for 31 hours, and the thing about stubbornness and bad habits is that they work right up until they don't. The formal session that the Arbiter called 2 days later was nothing like the opening ceremony. The hall was the same, the living crystal, the rivers of colored light, the concentric rings arranged around the central floor. But the arrangement of people in the rings had changed, and the change was not formal. No one had announced a new seating plan. People had simply moved, in the way that people move when the invisible architecture of a room has shifted, and the old positions no longer feel accurate. The inner ring had expanded. The Dreth ambassador sat closer to the center. The representative from the Omera Collective, who had missed the opening session and arrived to find the conclave in an entirely different configuration from the one described in the advance materials, was trying to quietly understand what had changed from his neighbors, rather than asking directly. I sat where the Arbiter's staff had placed me, second ring from the center. The Arbiter opened the session without ceremony. He had aged, somehow, in the past 3 days. Not visibly, not in any way you could photograph and point to, but in the quality of his presence. The 300-year administrator had encountered something that required him to revise, and revision at that age and at that level of authority is its own kind of difficulty. He was not a lesser person for it. If anything, he was a more honest one. He said, "The conclave will formally acknowledge the events of the past 72 hours. What followed was not a speech. It was a structured accounting, the kind that Velkarath process favors, which is comprehensive and precise, and leaves very little room for ambiguity." He stated what had occurred. He stated the contribution of the combined cluster fleet. He stated the contribution of the Sarath Vale fleet's active squadron. He stated, without minimizing and without exaggerating, the contribution of the Terran vessel operating independently. He stated the losses. Every ship, every crew designation, the Sarath ships by name, because Selvara had provided the full list that morning, and the Arbiter had incorporated it into the record without being asked to. Then he said something I had not expected. "The conclave will also formally acknowledge a proposal made in closed session on the first day of this gathering, which this body chose not to implement, and which, in retrospect, reflects a failure of its foundational principles." He meant the tribute proposal, the calculation about peripheral civilizations and who could be sacrificed. He said it without softening it, without the diplomatic language that makes terrible things sound like considered options. He said that the proposal had been made, that it had moved toward being acted upon, and that it had been stopped by a single intervention from a delegation that this body had placed in its outer ring. "That error will be corrected," he said, beginning with the seating arrangement. I was moved to the first ring that afternoon. Kethal submitted his reclassification report to the full conclave archive the following morning. It included the full recording from the observation tower, the complete sensor data from the engagement, and 40 pages of contextual analysis drawn from the 30 years of files he had spent his career building. The response from the conclave's member civilizations ranged across the full spectrum of possible reactions. The Muralax accepted the reclassification without objection and submitted a formal request for a meeting between their chief military command and Earth's equivalent, which I passed along to the relevant people. The Velkarath issued a lengthy official statement that managed to be gracious and slightly pained at the same time, which I thought was honest of them. Several Outer Ring civilizations sent personal communications to the Terran delegation, to me, specifically, that were less formal and considerably warmer. One of the more interesting responses came from the Dreth Collective. The ambassador requested a private meeting, which I granted. He arrived with 3 members of his scientific staff and spent 2 hours asking detailed, technical questions about the biological compatibility protocols Earth had developed for multi-species contact, the procedures for managing first contact situations in environments where different species' biological needs might create friction. He was, I realized about 20 minutes in, not asking because he was curious. He was asking because the Dreth were preparing for something. An expansion, maybe. A new contact situation they were managing. He was gathering practical knowledge. I answered his questions fully. All of them. He was leaving when he paused at the door and said, "I would like to formally apologize for the chair." "The chair," I said. "The first day, I moved my chair." "I know," I said. "You mentioned it." "I mentioned it briefly," he said. "I would like to state it more completely. In Dreth culture, the gesture of moving away from a new presence is a very specific communication. It signals that the new presence is being classified as potentially contaminating, potentially dangerous in a biological or social sense. It is not a casual gesture. It carries significant weight among us." He paused. "I made that gesture based on a classification that was entirely wrong. It was a natural mistake," I said. "Natural is not the same as correct," he said. "Among us, the appropriate response to having made that gesture incorrectly is to move closer, if you would permit it." He moved his chair, which he had brought into the room with him, to the place it would have been if he had not moved it on the first day. Close enough to be, by Dreth standard, a gesture of presence and acknowledgement. "Permitted," I said. He nodded once, picked up the chair again, and left with it. Ilara called me that evening with 2 things. The first, the boarding teams had begun accessing the Urveth vessels. The ships were dormant but structurally intact, and the initial assessments from the technical teams, Seraph engineers working alongside the 2 Terran specialists I had requested from our nearest station, were producing data that was going to take months to fully process. The ships were extraordinary, not in a way that made them admirable exactly, but in the way that something very old and very purpose-built is extraordinary when you examine it closely enough to understand the full depth of what it was built to do. The second thing Alara told me was that the signal she had sent at the beginning of the engagement, the one built from patterns extracted from Urveth communications, the 3-part message of, "We see you, we refuse, we respond," had been received not only by the scout and the local fleet. It had been received at the range their communication system operated across, which was considerably farther than the distance to the system boundary. "How far?" I asked. "Based on the carrier frequency and the power of their transmission systems," Ilara said, "the signal would be detectable by any Urveth communication infrastructure within approximately 200 light-years. I sat with that for a moment. "And the suppression event," I said. "The effect we produced at full deployment, how far would the ripple have been detectable?" "The full-spectrum ripple at the moment of completion," she said, "would have been visible to any sufficiently sensitive sensor system within approximately 300 light-years. 300 light-years, in a galaxy full of things we had not yet found. "So something may know what happened here," I said. "Something may know," she confirmed. "The specific communication we sent, combined with the signature of the suppression event, would be identifiable as a deliberate response to an Urveth advance. From whatever perspective receives it. Could be interpreted as a message," I said. "Yes," she said. "It could be interpreted as a message." I looked out the viewport of the communications room. The 3 sons of Velkarath had settled into their evening arrangement, a long, layered descent of color that the 3 separate light sources produced when they were at the right angle relative to each other. 300 light-years was an enormous distance, the kind of distance that puts things comfortably out of reach of most concerns. Or puts you within reach of something that had not previously known where to look. "Ilara," I said. "Yes. Send a report to Earth. Full technical briefing on the suppression event, the signal propagation, and the range implications. And flag it for the early warning network. That will take approximately 6 hours to prepare. Start now," I said, "and include your assessment of what a civilization capable of receiving that signal at 300 light-years would need to look like, technically." A pause. "That is a significant modeling question." "Yes," I said. "Take the time it needs. I want it right." "Understood." I closed the channel and stayed at the viewport for a while. What we had done in this system was necessary. It was right. It had protected a lot of lives and changed the position of Earth in the political structure of this cluster in ways that were going to matter for a long time. It had also, potentially, announced us to whatever was 300 light-years out. That was the nature of the thing I had been thinking about since Ilara first mentioned the signal range. Every action taken in a large and incompletely known environment is also a communication. You cannot operate in a space without sending information about your presence, your capabilities, your choices. The question is not whether you are visible. The question is what you are visible as. What the signal from this system had communicated, to anyone receiving it at range, was this: there is something in the Oran cluster that responds to Urveth advances with a specific kind of technology and a specific kind of refusal. Whether that was useful information or dangerous information depended entirely on who was receiving it. The Conclave was not going to think about this tonight. They were still processing what had just happened. The immediate crisis resolved, the alliance frameworks being established, the political reclassifications being negotiated. All of that was real and necessary and would occupy the next weeks of this gathering. But I was going to think about it. I had been thinking about it since the moment Ilara gave me the range numbers, and I was going to continue thinking about it until I had a clear picture of the implications, and then I was going to take that picture to the people who needed to see it and make sure they understood what it meant. Because preparation is not something you do before the dangerous thing and then stop doing after the dangerous thing has passed. It is something you do all the time, in every quiet moment between events, so that when the next event arrives, you are not starting from nothing, The formal alliance proposal between the Sereth Dominion and Terra reached Earth's government 9 days after the engagement. Earth responded in 11 hours. That response time, 11 hours for a decision of that magnitude, was not something I had predicted precisely, but it was consistent with what I knew about how Earth handles situations that have been considered in advance. The proposal did not arrive as a surprise. Earth's early warning network had been tracking the conclave, the Urveth approach, and the engagement in real time through Alara's transmissions. By the time the formal proposal arrived through diplomatic channels, the relevant departments had already spent a week in preliminary discussion. When a thing has been prepared for, it does not take long to decide. The response was yes, with a list of terms that matched Selvara's proposal closely and added 3 provisions that were not in her original version. The additional provisions were about the joint mission to the Urveth ships, specifically about the timeline, the information sharing protocol, and a clause that Earth had clearly already drafted before the proposal arrived, which indicated they had modeled this outcome in advance and had their preferred terms ready. I presented the response to Selvara in the private meeting she had requested for exactly this purpose. She read through it on the display I provided, taking her time with each term, asking clarifying questions on 2 of them. Not challenging questions, the kind that come from someone making sure they understand precisely what they are agreeing to before they agree to it. When she reached the 3 additional provisions, she read the relevant clause and then looked up at me. "You had this drafted before I made the proposal," she said. "Earth had it drafted," I said, "because your surveillance network had been modeling our civilization's direction for 15 years and had assessed that this proposal was a probable outcome of this conclave." "Among other possible outcomes, yes." She was quiet for a moment, not offended. I had been watching for that possibility, and it was not present. Thoughtful. "What were the other probable outcomes your models identified?" she asked. "Would you like the full list?" "Just the significant ones. Continued peripheral status for Terra, with no formal relationship with any cluster civilization above trade tier. That was the most likely outcome when I walked into the opening session." I paused. "Alliance with the Muralax Iron Pact, as an alternative to the Serath proposal. If the engagement had gone differently, or if the Muralax had moved more decisively during the early crisis period. And one other. Which was that the cluster's response to the Urveth would be the tribute arrangement," I said, "and that Earth would be required to respond to that unilaterally." She absorbed this, which would have meant something that I preferred not to have to do, I said, but would have done. She looked at me with the expression she had developed over the past 10 days, the one that was neither the theatrical pity of the opening session nor the uncertain reassessment of the crisis period, but something settled and direct that I thought was probably the closest thing to her actual face that she showed to most people. "You would have stopped it," she said. "Yes. Even if that meant acting against the decision of every major civilization in the cluster. The decision would have been wrong," I said. "Decisions made by large groups of powerful people are not automatically right just because of who is making them. They are right or wrong based on what they do to people who are not in the room, and the people who were not in that room did not have a vote," she said. "No, so I would have given them one." She nodded slowly. Then, she signed the alliance terms on behalf of the Sereth Dominion, with the formal Sereth authority seal that her position as third heir to the Obsidian throne gave her access to. She handed the signed document back to me, and I forwarded it to Earth's relevant department, which would process it through whatever formal mechanisms were required on our end, and produce the final ratified version within a week. "First alliance," she said, almost to herself. "First formal one," I said. "We have had informal ones. Relationships that developed from contact and worked well, without ever being written down." "The Helian Compact," she said. "Among others. Do you prefer the formal or the informal?" I thought about it. "Formal alliances have clarity," I said. "Everyone knows what is agreed and what is not. Informal relationships have flexibility. They can accommodate situations that the formal terms did not anticipate, without requiring renegotiation, every time something unexpected happens." I paused. "The best ones are formal, where it matters, and flexible, where it does not." "This one," she said. "Yes," I said. "This one should be." The conclave's final session, 3 days later was the longest single day of formal proceedings I had experienced in 20 years of this kind of work. 7 hours of structured discussion covering the Urveth situation, what had happened, what the ships in their dormant state represented, what should be done with them and over what timeline. The joint mission terms were ratified by the full conclave, rather than just the Serath-Terran bilateral arrangement, because the Muralax had requested involvement, and the Velkarath had several legitimate points about cluster-wide security that the mission should address. The mission structure that emerged was more complicated than what Selvara and I had originally planned, and probably better for being more complicated, because the additional parties brought different analytical approaches, and the Urveth ships were complex enough to benefit from multiple perspectives working simultaneously. Alara was assigned as the technical lead for the Terran component. She seemed pleased with this, in the specific way that she expresses being pleased, which is a slight increase in the precision of her communications, and a tendency to send reports ahead of schedule. Kethal was formally appointed as the mission archivist, which was not a position anyone had previously defined, but which everyone agreed was necessary the moment the Arbiter proposed it. He would document the technical findings in the same comprehensive way he had documented the engagement, with the same mandate to record accurately rather than diplomatically. The political reclassification of Terra was formalized. The ceremony was brief by Velkarath standards, which meant it took 40 minutes instead of 2 hours. The bioluminescent wall display that accompanied the new formal designation of Terra produced a color that the Velkarath had not used in a conclave hall before. A deep, layered silver that moved, that shifted as you watched it, that did not stay in one place. The Velkarath cultural advisor who was managing the display explained afterward that the color choice was intentional. In their chromatic tradition, colors that stay in one place represent things that are established and defined. Colors that move represent things that are still becoming. It was, I thought, an honest choice. During the final recess of the session, I found myself on the same observation balcony where Kethal had first found me, on the second day of the conclave. The triple-sun sky had the same quality it had had then, the layered light, the sense that the atmosphere was doing something slightly more than atmospheres are usually expected to do. Below the complex, the city of the Velkarath spread outward in all directions, its crystal structures catching and refracting the triple light in the same way the walls of the hall did, so that the whole city seemed to shimmer with stored color. I heard footsteps behind me and did not turn around. I knew from the weight of them. Drath Ven Cole came to stand beside me. He did not speak for a moment, which was not unusual for the Muralax. They are comfortable with silence in a way that most species are not. "My chief military command has confirmed the meeting request," he said finally. "They would like to send a delegation to Earth within the month. Earth is ready to receive them," I said. "There will be," he paused, with the care of a large, precise person choosing words, "adjustment required, on both sides. Our military culture has very specific protocols for these relationships." "I know," I said. "We have read everything we could find about Muralax military culture. I will tell you honestly that we are not certain we have read the right things or interpreted them correctly, and we would prefer to be told when we have gotten something wrong, rather than have the error sit and grow." "That is a reasonable position," he said. "We try." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Serath ships that held the engagement. My chief military council has formally entered them into the Muralax record of iron choices." "Selvara knows," I said. She was grateful. "It is not gratitude we offer," he said. "It is recognition. They held a place they could have left. We record that. It belongs in the record, regardless of what any individual civilization's relationship with the Muralax may be." "I understand," I said. "We would like," he said carefully, "to add a Terran vessel to the same record." I looked at him. "Your ship," he said. "The one called Alara. The engagement record shows that she maintained her mission parameters under direct fire from 3 pursuing vessels while simultaneously operating the suppression system. That is," he stopped, chose the next word with visible deliberation. "That is what we would call an iron choice, choosing the thing that needed to be done over the thing that was safer." "Alara chose," I said. "Yes," he said. "We understood that from the record. Your ship chose." A pause. "We do not normally record vessels. The iron choice belongs to the one who makes it, and normally that is a person. But Alara is the one who made the choice, I said. She held the parameters when she could have broken off. She decided. Then she belongs in the record, he said, if you will permit us to ask her. You can ask her directly, I said. She will have opinions about it, and she would rather give them herself than have me speak for her. Something that might have been surprise moved across Drath Ven Cole's face. Among the Muralax, the idea that a vessel is someone you ask rather than a tool you direct is not a standard framework. He processed it for a moment. Very well, he said. I will ask her. She will be honored, I said, and she will tell you that herself. He nodded once, deeply, which among the Muralax is a significant gesture of acknowledgement. Then he returned inside, and I turned back to the view. Alara contacted me a few minutes later. Drath Ven Cole just sent me a formal communication, she said, on his personal channel. I know. He asked if I would accept formal inclusion in the Muralax Iron record. I know, I said. I said yes. I know. I also told him that if he intended to record me, he should get the drive specifications right, because the previous 3 times someone has attempted to catalog me in an official document, they have listed my drive class incorrectly, and I would prefer not to spend eternity in the wrong category. I laughed, actually laughed. I do not do it often enough, which is a failing I am aware of. What did he say? I asked. He said he would request the specifications directly from Earth's technical database and verify them personally. Good, I said. He is thorough. He will get it right. Darren, she said. Yes. Earth's response to my transmission came in this morning. The technical briefing about the signal propagation and the range implications. The tone of her voice told me before the content did. What was the response? They want me back, she said. Not for the conclave. For a full debrief on the signal analysis. They have been running independent models and they want to compare findings. A pause. And there is a secondary reason. Tell me. The early warning network picked up something, she said. At approximately 280 light-years from here. A signal. Not Urveth. They do not have anything in range, and the dormant fleet is not transmitting. Something else. The signal is structured in a way that suggests it is a response to what happened here. I stood very still on the balcony. A response, I said. Yes. Not a threat signal. Not an approach signal. The analysts describe it as a brief pause. An acknowledgement signal. The equivalent, in whatever system produced it, of noting that something has happened and that someone has noticed. 280 light-years. Something that had sensors capable of detecting what we had done here at that range. Something that had a communication system capable of responding in a form that Earth's early warning network could identify as structured and intentional. Something that knew we existed and had chosen to acknowledge it. How long have I got before I need to be on my way? I asked. The debrief is scheduled for 3 weeks from today, she said. Given that Earth is 4 days travel from here at standard approach, you have some time in hand. Good, I said. I have things to finish here first. I expected that. I closed the channel and stayed on the balcony for a while longer, watching the triple sunlight do its slow work on the crystal city below. 300 years this city had been here. 600 years since the hall behind me had been begun. Civilizations that thought in those timescales had a particular relationship with patience that Earth was still learning. We were 62 years old. We had made every possible mistake a new spacefaring civilization can make, and some that required genuine creativity. We had built something out of the failures, not despite them, but because of them, that was, by any honest accounting, unlike anything else the cluster had produced. And now something 280 light-years away had noticed. I thought about the conclave opening session, the dull gray flicker on the wall, the laughter that had not bothered to conceal itself, the princess with the 4 eyes, and the absolute conviction of someone who had never been required to question the categories she navigated by, the seat in the outer ring. I thought about what it had taken to get from that moment to this one, not the technical work. The technical work was real and required real capability, but capability without direction is just potential. And potential without the willingness to use it in the right moment is nothing at all. What it had taken was this. Walking into the room, with the intention of being exactly what was needed, regardless of what the room thought you were. Not performing confidence, not pretending to be larger than you are. Just knowing what you are and not accepting the category that a room full of wrong assumptions tries to put you in. We are still here. That is enough. It is not a boast. It is not a threat. It is just the most important fact about a species that has been told, repeatedly and by a variety of well-credentialed sources, that it should not have survived the things it has survived. We survived anyway. We learned from surviving. We built something from the learning. And now the universe was noticing. I went back inside. There were alliance documents to review, technical briefings to prepare for the joint mission teams, and a meeting with Selvara that I had promised for the evening. Not a diplomatic meeting, not a formal session, just the continuation of a conversation about 62 years of history that had started in a stone corridor, and that I had found, to my own genuine surprise, to be one of the better conversations I had had in a very long time. I also needed to talk to Kethal about the signal. He would want it in the record, the acknowledgement from 280 light-years, the implication of whatever was out there, the fact that the universe had looked in our direction and sent something back. He would want to document it carefully, with the full context, in the way he documented everything, not dramatically, not with the language of fear or of triumph, but accurately. The way things that are true deserve to be recorded. I had one stop first. I went to the communications room and opened the channel to Alara. "Still there?" I asked. "Always," she said. "Run me the early warning analysis on the signal," I said. "Full detail. I want to understand everything we currently know about what is out there, before the debrief." "Sending now." A brief pause. "Darren." "Yes." "Whatever it is," she said, "we will figure it out." I looked at the data coming through on the display. The signal analysis, the range calculations, the structural patterns that Earth's analysts had identified as intentional and responsive. An unknown quantity at an enormous distance, in a galaxy that had already produced the Krath swarm, and the Urveth, and 7 other things that most of the cluster had classified as mythological, right up until they arrived. "Yes," I said. "We will." I put the flask in my pocket and went to work.